Sadly enough, this is the last session. I think we could have gone on for at least a week in this good company. So we continue introducing John Tresch. Welcome up on the stage, talking about religion and science, Jung and Einstein.
Something like that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's perfect. I know where I am. Welcome back, everyone, and it's been a real pleasure. All the first two sessions were incredibly stimulating. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really enjoying this, and want to share with you my own thoughts on the matter of where did Eranos come from. Next, I want to put Eranos in the context of, although, as many have said, it didn't have a single ideology or shared worldview, it was very much interested in contributing to a new worldview, a Weltanschauung, a Weltbild. And I want to put the images that showed up there and led into it in a much longer history of images of the world, images of the cosmos or cosmograms. Going back to the medieval period in multiple traditions, into the early modern period, the cosmographia tradition of the 16th century, into more modern images of the cosmos as ways of realizing and conveying the structure of the universe as a whole. Interestingly, in Eranos, at the moment of Eranos, the concept of worldview, Weltanschauung or world image, Weltbild, was central in philosophical and human science reflection. It was very self-conscious. What is a worldview? How do we make a new one? Is being debated in many sites. The term goes back at least to Kant. He made it so that our knowledge of and experience of the world is relative to our worldview. We experience the world through a worldview. His own Weltbild, his own image of the world, drew on Newton and Euclid and their foundations of space and time. And for Kant, anything that went beyond the mathematical, the geometrical, or empirical demonstration was not science. It was useful, a cosmological idea or an idea of reason, but not actual knowledge. So his work left an interesting tension, especially after the critique of judgment, between, on the one hand, the push to build up a scientific worldview, and then, on the other, the need to put it within a broader, unverifiable cosmological framework. What's the bigger cosmology that it's part of, even though one can't make any positive statements about that cosmology, as a way of orienting people ethically, aesthetically, and politically. So that call to build up a worldview of modern sciences and put it within a broader cosmology was very much taken up by the generation of idealists in Romanticism and Naturphilosophie, as Leif talked about. Alexander von Humboldt is part of this mix and also drew an aesthetically stirring and scientifically valid universe, especially in his series of books, Cosmos, which is really the term that the book that brings the term cosmos into wide discussion. You can do the n-gram on Google. It really picks up after Humboldt. Later in the century, Neo-Kantian philosophy was deeply focused on worldviews and world pictures. Hermann Cohen, Dilthey, Cassirer, and many others reckoned with the diverse views of the world that were coming in from philology, history, and anthropology, also asking how to incorporate these as well as new findings from science into a modern Weltanschauung, a modern Weltbild. Phenomenology also reflected on the relations between scientific schemes and other forms of knowledge, and perhaps most famously Heidegger summed it up by saying, "The present is the age of the collision of world pictures, the age of the struggle for a new world picture." And I don't know if that has anything to do with him watching soccer on his neighbor's TV, but it might. Einstein himself, in 1931, put together a collection of essays, My Worldview, My World Image. So this sense of the need to explain what a worldview is, to draw on the worldviews that have existed in the past, and join the new findings of science in order to create a new modern worldview, was very much aggravated in the early 20th century by World War I, by the sense of a cosmological breakdown, a breakdown in previous concepts, a challenge and a clash of worldviews. Especially in 1917, where there were world-shaking events such as the Russian Revolution and the Spanish flu epidemic, all in the same year. So that's the year in which two very influential attempts to paint a new world picture showed up from Albert Einstein and Carl Jung. And I'm going to look at these two together as precursors to some of the debates and questions at Eranos. So they're both textual, they're both written, numbers and words, but they both pose interesting questions about images and visualization. And they also prepare many of the concerns of Eranos, where, as has been discussed, it wasn't just the history of religions and philosophy, but also in interesting ways, the sciences that were brought to the table. Schrödinger spoke there. Adolf Portman, who ran the Eranos groups from the 60s, was a biologist, a philosophical biologist. Jung's work that emerged out of his collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli, Synchronicity, was debuted at Eranos in the early 1950s. So how to integrate this exploration of historical worldviews with the new sciences and established sciences was one of the many themes explored there. The juxtaposition of these two is not just in time, it's also in space. They knew each other in Zurich. Both were living there from 1910 to 1913. They hung out at some of the same cafes. Einstein was interested in psychoanalysis. Jung was very interested in Einstein and often declared he didn't understand his theories, but was interested in building up the scientific prestige of psychoanalysis, and he thought that Einstein, like Pauli, could contribute to that belief that the impression that psychoanalysis is a science on a par with physics. Of course, there were other connections between science and psychology at the time, and one of the places is in the occult, as Jennifer mentioned, the research into X-rays, new elements, radioactivity, and the sense that these new emanations or energies, which are suddenly made visible, might make sense both of science and justify the theories of occultists and theosophists. One of the key concepts here is that of a firm or elastic ether, which transmits vibrations and transmits electromagnetism, light and heat, but also transmits thought and spirit. This is connected to the spatial fourth dimension, which allows these invisible properties to be transmitted at a distance. And of course, as Jennifer also pointed out, this showed up in new ways of visualizing thought in theosophy and in new artworks, from Kandinsky to Hilma af Klint to Olga Fröbe-Kapteyn. So that's one place where science, psychology, the occult, and questions about visual representation are meeting, and that's part of the background for the encounter between Einstein and Jung, or the semi-encounter between Einstein and Jung. So first, some of the background of Einstein's essay in 1917. Around 1900, most astronomers assumed that the physical universe was centered around the Milky Way galaxy. That was basically what the whole physical universe was, empty space afterwards, or beyond it, and at the center, our own solar system was there. One of the people to measure this out statistically was Jacobus Kapteyn, who was a teacher of Einstein's colleague Willem de Sitter, and happens to be Olga's uncle, so a strange connection there. Physics tended to follow Newtonian assumptions: gravity, gravitational attraction, uniform space and time, an infinite space, an unending space filled with the light-bearing ether. New puzzles about Newtonian cosmology had recently emerged, some connected to thermodynamics, like entropy, with its implication that the energy of the universe would eventually dissipate, causing the heat death of the universe. This led to large-scale questions about the universe's size and its history, some of which were dealt with in biology as well, in the kinds of evolutionary schemes that Bob mentioned. In Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, time was shown to be relative to the standpoint of the observer, mass shown to be a form of energy. They're interconvertible. His 1916 essay on general relativity showed that gravity arises from the curvature of space and time, and that the geometric structure of a region of space depends upon the mass and energy of objects. So these are pretty radical claims. They upset a lot of commonsensical experiences of space, time, matter, and energy. They also overturned Newtonian assumptions. But despite these radical implications and its non-commonsensical implications, Einstein's was a resolutely physical theory. There was no longer any ether that allowed the transmission of light or of thought and spirit. There was no longer an opening to the fourth dimension of space that was entertained by many theosophists and occultists. That was one of the results of relativity. While in 1916, he had only considered relativistic phenomena within a certain portion of the universe, he immediately sought to extend relativity to the universe as a whole and construct a cosmology. And the result, he said to a friend in 1917, exposes me to the danger of being committed to a madhouse. So he knew he was pushing the limits here. One particular issue that Einstein faced concerned boundary conditions. So this is the essay that was published in 1917. Newton's infinite space meant that radiation and matter would eventually be lost in infinity, as he argued, great enough to send a star on its journey to infinity whence it can never return. So he was worried that if we have the infinite space of Newton, there's nothing stopping all of matter from just dissipating out into infinity without end. He was also troubled by what he called Mach's principle, that the motion of bodies is affected by masses at great distances, which is impossible to approximate across an infinite universe. So his solution to some of these Newtonian problems in this essay was to present the universe as a sphere that is finite but not bounded. That's the key concept. It's finite but not bounded. Try and get your head around that. He presented himself to insist on how empirical and commonsensical it was. He presented himself basically as a Humboldtian field scientist, saying, like a geodesist, our procedure resembles that of approximating the shape of the Earth's surface, which on a small scale is extremely complicated, but he's simplifying things by picturing the great sphere of space. This sphere, this finite but not bounded sphere, is notoriously difficult to visualize. One way you might picture it is to compare a two-dimensional disk to a three-dimensional sphere. If you walk to the edge of the disk, eventually you reach an edge, a boundary. But if you walk around on a sphere, it's a finite space, but you never reach an end. So that's an analogy. How you connect this to a four-dimensional space-time, what's outside that space? What are you breathing when you're walking on the surface of this sphere? That still escapes me and lots of physics students today. Although his solution, he insisted, was logically consistent, this difficulty of visualization remained. Likewise, it doesn't give a means of adding measurement, giving a measurement of the universe, which even by Mach's standards means that it's not necessarily a scientific, verifiable theory. Einstein's essay was the starting point for modern cosmology, even though it was quickly surpassed by the Big Bang theory, which showed this universe as existing over time, developing over time. And it's still referred to, its basic methods and calculations in astrophysics and particle cosmology. This new cosmos was not physically bounded or easy to picture, but he clearly felt a cosmological imperative to gather the disruptive views that relativity introduced into a single unitary whole. So now, very quickly to Jung's Cosmos, which will be familiar to many of you here. That essay also followed a breakdown, which started around 1913. He broke with Freud, withdrew from clinical work and teaching. He worried he'd go mad. He began speaking to, in active imagination, his spirit guides, drawing images of his visions, which gathered together as the Red Book. And these experiences were very much anticipated by earlier occult experiences and paranormal experiences from his youth. His mother was a medium, his cousin likewise, and that was the basis of his PhD, his medical dissertation. He, in this period, transcribed the 7 sermons, which were illustrated with this cosmological map, later perfected in this form, showing the procession of spirit and matter, animal and human, shadow and ego, all integrated into the system of the world as a whole. He also drew up his findings just as he came out of this descent into hell in 1917 in the language of science. This is the pivotal 1917 essay, laying out his concepts and the structure of the mind. He begins by contrasting Freud and Adler, the Eros drive and the will to power. These are differences of temperament, differences of type, of personality types, extroversion and introversion. These attitudes and functions are available to everyone, but are valued more strongly by some. Nevertheless, energy requires the tension of opposites, the productive encounter of ego and shadow, of conscious and unconscious. He goes on to define the persona and relate it to the collective unconscious. And he spells out here this theory as well as the archetypes, which show up in dreams and creative works, psychic realities that work, ruling powers, gods, images of the dominant laws and principles. And personal development means integrating these impersonal entities into a more complete experience of the self. The transcendent function, what he calls that, involves the realization in all its aspects of the personality originally hidden away. This is the process of individuation, creating one whole out of all these disparate parts. His essay repeatedly refers to physics, including relativity. He talks about Otto Meyer's discovery of thermodynamics, energy gradients and tensions. Often he aligns himself with the phylogenetic theories that Bob was mentioning. The memory of living matter, he calls the collective unconscious the repository of man's experience. Now this perspective would lead us to see psyche as arising from the body, right? A consequence of matter, biology, evolution, and the physical body within an ordinary scientific ontology. But then there are many intriguing turns. Just in the same paragraph, he says, archetypal images can be taken as intuitive concepts for physical phenomena. Ether, the primordial breath or soul substance, is a concept found all over the world, and energy is an intuitive idea. The implication is that the concepts through which we grasp material reality are themselves the product of the psyche and the collective unconscious. So this offers a very different picture. We may well be physical beings, but what we think of as physical reality is a product of the mind. Mind precedes the physical cosmos, or is at least bound up in its realization. Here is later, Jung holds open the door to the original sense of archetype, as in theology and later German idealism, an original thought or mind out of which even material reality emerges. At the very moment that physics becomes increasingly difficult to visualize, psychology fixes on the need for visual images. What do we do with this? Is that if Einstein's universe is finite but not bounded, Jung's was bounded but not finite. The structures of the self and cosmos have to be drawn and circumambulated even as they channel potentially infinite forces. Jung kept open in this essay and then throughout his dialogues and conversations the possibility that the archetypes were on the one hand bodily based and on the other hand drew on collective energies that went beyond the limits of the individual body. So that opening in its dialogue with the entirely physical cosmology of Einstein is the one I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
John. Thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting story. So in 1970, Jung goes very deep into the mind, the unconscious, and Einstein goes very far out into the universe, into space. How were these groundbreaking ideas received at that time? Differently by different groups. Einstein was not yet Einstein. He was well known for relativity, but not widely accepted. People still thought physics was finished. They also that it had been completed, and that relativity was just a quirk. So there were some physicists with whom he was in very deep dialogue who took it very seriously. But it took a while. It took the observation of the shift in light past Mercury's orbit, which was seen as an empirical proof of relativity, for Einstein to begin to be celebrated as the Einstein we know today. Jung was building up his profile within psychoanalysis and began to look beyond traditional psychoanalysis for an audience and for sources. And one of the results is Eranos. But were they a sort of a product of a zeitgeist? At a very broad level, definitely. And that's the sense, as you mentioned at the start, that the world was breaking down. The cosmos that we've received, and that many are saying is going to be held together by science, industry, and technology, is not viable any longer. Some new opening is required. Can we say that their theories were partly based on intuition, as real great science always is? You can't prove it, but you understand it must be that way.
Definitely. They both testify to the power of the imagination and its necessity in creating a livable world picture. Right? Einstein is radical and shakes things up. The next generation of quantum physicists shake things up even more. The leap into the unthinkable becomes part of what physics holds as its proudest trait. And I think a kind of counterintuitive intuition is very much what people go for in Jung.
The key word is imagination. Thank you, John. Thank you very much indeed. We are now going to connect with Charles Stang and connect with the angels as well, Charles. So nice to have you here in this way. I give the floor to you.
So thankfully, Henri Corbin needs no introduction here. In recent years, and in my capacity as the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School, I've attempted to revive interest in Corbin and to reimagine his legacy for the future. But today I wish to speak of the past, of the distant past, and its influence on our more recent past. I want to speak of the influence of ancient Neoplatonism on Corbin, and thereby, directly or indirectly, on Eranos, and thereby on us, we who are turning to Eranos for inspiration and critical reorientation. For me, this is not merely a minor chapter in the history of ideas, but rather a case study in how Neoplatonism has come to serve as a perennial source or resource for the revivification of modern thought. In other words, much like his Roman Catholic contemporaries with respect to the Greek and Latin patristic tradition, Corbin was involved in a creative project of ressourcement, like them, under the Latin slogan ad fontes, that is, a return, quote, to the sources. The sources to which Corbin returned again and again were what he called the Islamic Theosophists, the medieval Persian Ishraqiyun or Illuminationists, chief among them his self-described sheikh and guide, Suhrawardi. In volume 2 of his magnum opus On Islam Iranien, Corbin describes the whole of the Ishraqiyun as Persian Platonists. And throughout his corpus, he champions this tradition over against what he perceives to be the deadening influence of Aristotelianism, Sunni orthodoxy, and modern materialism, secularism, and historicism. For Corbin, Plato, or Aflatun, as he's known in Arabic, is the sage whose name stands for what is most worth preserving in the philosophical tradition, especially when it is wed to the prophetology of the Abrahamic traditions or peoples of the book. Despite his reverence for Plato and Platonism, for the most part, Corbin's engagement with the original authors and texts of this ancient tradition was rather superficial and was mediated through other historical thinkers and contemporary scholars. Near the end of his life, however, he engaged the ancient authors more directly and to great effect. 3 of his late essays were collected and published posthumously in 1981 as The Paradox of Monotheism. They are, the title essay, The Paradox of Monotheism, Apophatic Theology as an Antidote to Nihilism, and The Necessity of Angelology. In this collection, he takes up the entangled themes of angelology and apophasis and creatively reconceives them as an antidote to the ills of modernity, which lead to a kind of paralytic nihilism. So today I want to comment on the latter 2 of the 3 essays in reverse order. So I'll begin with The Necessity of Angelology. Corbin begins with the exoteric etymology of angel, from the Greek word angelos, meaning messenger. Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian have their exoteric equivalents. However, this exoteric etymology, he claims, hides an esoteric angelic function, namely theophany. Angels are what enable an absolutely transcendent divinity to appear, to show itself, and without them, quote, that which we easily call monotheism perishes in illusory triumph. Hence, the necessity of angelology, Angels steer between Scylla and Charybdis, between agnosticism and anthropomorphism. At the apophatic end of the spectrum, the unknown god, or deus absconditus, threatens to remain forever unknown and inaccessible. This is the agnosticism against which Corbin warns us. At the cataphatic end of the spectrum, the divine runs the risk of being reduced to an ens supremum, a supreme being, to which we inevitably attach the names and attributes that fashion it in our image. This is the anthropomorphism against which he also warns. Angels allow us to avoid both unfortunate ends. But how? In order to answer that question, Corbin turns to the 5th century philosopher Proclus, who was heir to the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, and was also the Diadochos, or head of the Platonic Academy in Athens. In the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, the source from which all else emerges is called the One, to hen. For Proclus, following Plotinus, the One must be beyond being, hyperousios, because it is the very source of all beings. And between the One beyond being, to hen, and the multitude of beings, Proclus famously inserts a class of transcendent gods, which he calls henads, each of which stands at the top of causal chains that emanate downward into ever-widening diversity. Like the One, or hen, who sits above them all, these henads are also transcendent and unknowable to us. Proclus assimilates them to the Greek gods, and thereby places a monotheism of the One over a traditional pagan polytheism. In any case, these henads emanate downward, as it were, and they diversify into beings, creatures, such as we each find ourselves to be. These emanations, however, are in fact angels. And these angels serve both a demiurgic function in that they bring beings into existence, and they serve a revelatory function in that they communicate with those very beings, initiating them into the chain of being, of which they are each a part, and summoning them to ascend ever higher, link by link. This is the dual theophanic function of angels. They are the demiurgic and revelatory aspects or agents of the henad gods. They are both causal and communicative. When we are met by an angel, we might think that we are meeting a separate being sent by the gods with an individualized message for us. And so it is, in a sense. But for Corbin, there's a deeper structure at work in which but for Corbin's appropriation of Proclus, there's a deeper structure at work in which the angel is not a being separate from us, but rather a higher instantiation of each of us in the causal chain of being at whose head is a god. An angel is that theophanic aspect of the God that both creates and communicates with us. In other words, we exist because of angels, and we exist because we are angels. And the angel is the capacity of every being to ascend beyond itself in ecstasy. As Corbin writes, quote, "The human soul descending into this world emanates from the angel who is its demiurge, and who is then its double or its celestial self, its divine counterpart." So in the interest of time, I want to circle back briefly to the title of this essay, The Necessity of Angelology. In its deep structure, Corbin insists Neoplatonic angelology aligns with the esoteric angelology of the Abrahamic traditions. He argues that angels, at least their esoteric theophanic function, that angels have been suppressed by movements within both Orthodox Christianity and Islam, and by secular versions of those same movements in modernity. So what happens when we suppress what is in fact necessary, when we suppress the angelic function of beings? For Corbin, angels are the links in the chains that make up the universe. To lose sight of angels, to lose contact with them, is to isolate ourselves in our current and quotidian states, to break the causal and communicative link with the God to which we each owe our individual existence. So to quote the title of the first essay in this collection, The paradox at the heart of monotheism is that the mediating ranks of angels are necessary to prevent an annihilating distance between an unknown God and its creatures. Monotheism requires a kind of polytheism in the form of angels, for angels make possible the integrity of a causal and communicative cosmos. The second essay of Corbin's I wish to introduce is entitled Apophatic Theology as Antidote to Nihilism. So let's begin with that last word, nihilism. Corbin regards nihilism, more specifically metaphysical nihilism, as proceeding from radical agnosticism. So recall that agnosticism and anthropomorphism are the two ends of the spectrum that Corbin warned us against in the previous essay. Agnosticism does not mean, as it often does today, uncertainty about whether God exists. Rather, it names an alarming condition in which the unknown and unknowable God remains completely inaccessible to us, in a kind of transcendental exile. Angels are meant to forestall that exile through their theophanic function. But according to Corbin, our culture has largely forgotten how to see, hear, or speak to angels. That is, how to activate our angelic function. The result of, quote, radical agnosticism, or the exile of the divine, is that we're thrown into a two-dimensional world, like Edwin Abbey's famous Flatland, in which we fail to recognize, quote, any reality beyond the horizon of empiricism and rational certitudes. That is, according to Corbin, where we find ourselves, idolaters of rationality, certainty, and the empirical sciences. This is nihilism. So, how can apophatic theology possibly serve as an antidote to this nihilism? After all, negative or apophatic theology is a practice of negating the names and attributes of God in recognition that God is beyond them all, always unknown and unknowable. If apophatic theology delivers us into agnosia or unknowing, and agnosticism results in metaphysical nihilism, how can apophatic theology serve as an antidote of nihilism? Prima facie, it seems rather to be a cause of nihilism. So in order to appreciate Corbin's claim, we have to return to Proclus and understand Corbin's creative appropriation of Neoplatonism. For Proclus, much like Plotinus before him, we have to approach the one beyond being, the unknowable and unknowable source, through negations. The one is not being. The one is not an intellect or an intelligible object. It is not temporal, having neither beginning nor end. It's not material, not mortal. You get the idea. The one is beyond all those names. But each one of those negations also threatens to become a new idolatrous affirmation, a temptation to think that we know the unknowable one by way of a negation. But ultimately, our negations are no more true than are our affirmations. And so Proclus recommends what has come to be called the negation of negation. If the one is not being, so too the one is not being. This double negation serves to dethrone any and all negations, and it also serves as a kind of wormhole where transcendence delivers us back into immanence. But for Proclus, the negation of negation, or the double negation, is something we do in our efforts to encounter the unknown God. But Corbin turns this upside down and insists that it is the one, or what he will now call the absolute, who performs the first double negation. The one, or the absolute, is itself a negation, that which is entirely free in the sense of being unconditioned, unfettered, infinite, indeterminate. This negative absolute then absolves itself, frees itself from its unconditioned freedom. This double negation thereby brings the absolute into determination, and so into relation. With determination, the absolute first takes on a face and becomes a person. The absolute's double negation is therefore not the death of God, but the eternal birth of God as a person, or as the personal God. And it is personalism, Corbin insists, that is the antidote to nihilism, recognizing that every being, apart from the abysmal and absolute source of all being, that every being is in fact a determinate being with a face, and thus a person, saves us from flatland nihilism, from the idolatry of rationality and empiricism. A thoroughgoing personalist ontology, therefore, renders the universe into a world of persons with faces. And by recognizing our place in this ecology of persons, we are paradoxically freed from anthropomorphism. In other words, by recognizing that we humans are persons, and persons among other more than human persons, we are released from fashioning the divine or the world in the image of humans. So, if apophasis is an antidote to nihilism, so too personalism is an antidote to anthropomorphism. I'll conclude with this. Since we are exploring what relevance Eranos might have for us today, and what resonance there might be between what Corbin famously called the time of Eranos and our own time, I'd like to conclude with asking you all whether you feel if Corbin's diagnosis of modernity's ill still rings true, and if so, whether his proposed antidotes, apophasis and angelology, also ring true, or not, and why. Thank you so much.
Charles, in Corbin's angelology, where does Jesus fit in? Is he some kind? I mean, he takes bodily form to prove that the invisible God exists. So, is he an angel?
That very good question. So Corbin tries to revive a Christology from the very early church, which is sometimes called angel Christology, which does exactly what, as you suggested, suggests that the name Christ is a kind of angelic presence that descends on the human being or adopts the human being, Jesus of Nazareth. So Corbin actually has an anti-incarnational Christology and owns what is sometimes called a docetic Christology. That is, Christ only seems to be human. The Christ is actually an angel.
You said that Orthodox Christianity has suppressed angels. Do you think that people still secretly believe in angels because, as you said, monotheism needs polytheism?
Well, Corbin thinks that certainly Western Christianity is in a rather sad state, and he indexes that to different historical moments where he thinks the kind of mediating ranks of the angels were evacuated from Western metaphysics. Certainly, many Christians of all varieties still believe in angels, but I think Corbin regards those Christians as believing in the exoteric function of angels. That is, that they're like a special class of beings that God uses as messengers, and that very few Christians are relating to angels as in their theophanic function. Curiously, and then perhaps my time is up, he thinks Jakob Böhme is one such person, in addition to Eckhart and Rilke. So there are some modern angelologists out there.
Well, are angels some kind of archetype that exists in many religions? I'm thinking about Homer, where he lets Athena walk side by side in a human body next to Ulysses, giving him advice and then disappearing up again.
So this will test the traditions I work in are sort of Mediterranean into the Near East. So certainly we have Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions of angels, but there's also pagan angels and Corbin is also deeply interested in the Zoroastrian angelic tradition. Perhaps Jessica could speak to the ways in which angels function in India. That's beyond the scope of my knowledge.
Sure. Thank you, Charles. Stay with us and listen to Allan Guggenbühl.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Welcome.
much for inviting
You've
me.
noticed that I'm a little lax on time, but not with you, Allan. It's 15 minutes.
It's 15 minutes. I'm Swiss,
We'll see
so
what
I'm always
happens.
punctual. Okay.
We'll see what happens.
Might speed it up. Well, thank you very much for. We're talking about Eranos, and I want to relate my first encounter with Eranos, and I think it was in the late 60s. I remember that a group of friends of my father's, they were talking, they had a heated debate whether they should go to Eranos or not, whether it is worthwhile to visit the conference. It was James Hillman, Rafael Lopez, my father, and others. And then I remember someone say, well, you can't go to Eranos. The people there are far too clever. They're far too knowledgeable. They kind of drift off. And when you go there and come back, you're confused. And you can't deal with current issues. So that was the debate. And that was I didn't know anything about Eranos. I just know this place somewhere in the Ticino which we could visit. And that was my first encounter. Now, of course, I'm a psychologist, and as a psychologist, you always should look at all the facts, the situation as it is. When you have a patient, you don't just read the reports, you actually see the patient, you study him. And there are many different aspects which are important when you want to draw conclusions. What does someone do? What does a group of people do? So what was important, of course, what goes on in the mind, what someone thinks, the theories, the talking. Talking is a way of grooming, so that's what apes do too, so that is important. But also important, of course, has been emphasized, is the body, the bodily experience, the sensations, the feelings, the emotions, the movements. These all reveal some kind of messages you don't know. Then the way they behave with each other is important, of course. Also, what is important, sense and a lot of things. So all these things, these aspects have to be taken in considerations when you want to say something about people gathering. Also, the surrounding, the collective, the zeitgeist is important. What is the times? And I had the occasion about a year ago to see a film about an Eranos conference. And it was, someone mentioned it, it was interesting to see actual people moving, Jung moving, and all these people. And actually it was fascinating to see that film. There was a film about the Eranos conference in black and white. First of all, you thought it's a gathering it's very crowded. And people had to go up and down and offer, so and sit there and everything talking, and a lot of smoking, of course, a lot of drinking, and a lot of agitation. People who were left isolated, nobody I ever talked to. Some people who were kind of more attractive, and so it was a really crowded area going up and down. A lot of drinking, Paul mentioned that. Some of them seemed to be tipsy. And you could see there were boats passing and apparently neighbors complaining. That wasn't in the film. So it was fascinating to see all these people, crowded there, talking, sort of. Some gave themselves importance, others less. But the ending of the film was fascinating. And I think a fifth of the film was a very distinctive scene, which really impressed me most. That was the moment they left Eranos. They all walked up these stairs onto the road, and then the cars came. And the big question was, who goes with what car? Some poor visitors didn't have a car. And some cars were very flashy, and some cars were not flashy. And I still remember the person with the flashiest, biggest car was Jung. He had some kind of, I don't know which type of cars, but he had kind of a big, so he was the most. Now, what I'm saying, this is, this shows that Eranos was actually a very is a very interesting gathering. And of course, you could see they were passionate scholars. That's what you could see from the film. They were passionate about what they talked about. You could also see that they came from different areas because they had heated discussions. It's not kind of a reunion where everybody agreed and nodded. And also what you see, it was chaotic. Chaotic, not like many of you know, it's some kind of academic reunion where everybody's here, and so, which I don't know how they kept time, but
happy I didn't moderate.
yes, would have been a challenge. Yes, so it was actually, and you could see this passionate scholars, and as we know, there's scholars from very different fields. It was interesting also they were not representatives of certain institutions, or they were not representatives of a certain belief system. And I think that was actually a very original and extraordinary. Because if you know, then many of you will probably share my ideas. Today in academia, it's all about funding, it's about predefined goals, it's about evidence-based. So it's actually just looking the outward world and not allowing this kind of confusion. And there's an interesting guy, a cognitive psychologist, says, when do people have insights? When do they have new ideas? David Galanter. And he says, actually, we have a lot more insight ideas. Our mind broadens when we're in a slightly confused, distracted mode. That's when we get new ideas. And when we start being concentrated and kind of concentrating on what we want to do or believe, has no connection, I don't think so, then actually our mind closes down. Then we gain competences and we gain importance. We may be successful, because we get the funding and whatever, but the mind closes down. And I think that's so original about Eranos because it actually allowed different scholars to come, to talk freely, and it allowed not to understand each other. It wasn't just colleagues you talk to, not just colleagues. With me, it wouldn't be just psychologists, so people from very different time, from very different backgrounds, and not institutions. So they weren't kind of bound to some kind of belief system or unconscious. So that, I think, was one of the great. And there, I think, we could learn nowadays, for academia, for universities. I think that is we in Switzerland try to do something else. So, and also drinking, moving, so everything was included. This was actually allowing to expand the mind. Now the question is, and this is of course the meaning, what is the archetype behind it? And as been mentioned all the time, and I think human beings are not just ego orientated, although we believe that and we give ourselves importance because what we say is often self-convincing and what we say is also in kind of enhancing our own importance, but we're actually also part of the collective. And I think many ideas we've got, many thoughts we've got are a sign of the zeitgeist or a sign of something collective, which a pattern which actually makes us behave or look in a certain direction. I think this is very important. So actually we should also have a kind of humbleness when we talk. It's just words with you, but why we say this or that, why we have this insight is actually is more difficult to say. And there I think if we think of the archetypes, of course, is a pattern which is transcendent. It's a very unpopular idea at university and where I worked. It's not allowed to talk about archetypes, but it's fascinating. I sometimes do it among teachers, and they're fascinated usually by this idea. Well, we have different archetypes, and they start to understand themselves because one teacher might be more artistic, another teacher might be more a control freak. They start to understand. So I think this deeper layer, I think, helps us also to think of archetypes, to understand what actually helped to give this energy to the Eranos conference. And there I think Nietzsche's book about the Geburt der Tragödie, where he says, what is actually the origins of culture helps us, because he says two archetypes. You know, archetypes is actually, it's all a speculation, and what an archetype really is per definition, it's transcendent, it's difficult to identify. But mythology, of course, this is what James Hillman points out, mythologies, of course, can help us to understand what maybe a basic collective pattern might be. Someone mentioned it today, the archaic pattern might be, which must help us to understand. So actually, Nietzsche then said, it's of course Apollo and Dionysos, these two archetypes. So one aiming for clarity, aiming to be understood, aiming for a certain goal, to kind of put it into categories, and the Dionysian, which someone mentioned, you know, Paul mentioned, I think, tearing it up, dissolving, presenting to self, doing anything, like getting confused, you know, in order to find a new possibility. I think these two archetypes, and Eranos, I think, was a special occasion which allowed these two archetypes to kind of confront each other, to mingle. That of course, a lot of danger. You mentioned people might have been tipsy, you know. But I think that's the originality, and in some ways, this is something which is needed. And I'm very glad that this evening we'll have a drink probably, and alcohol's allowed. We don't do smoking anymore, so that's so we do. So this, I think, is what I think is important with Eranos, and so unrestrained thoughts, and also eat Westmead. I think, you know, human beings needs occasions where they can drift out with their minds, where they can fantasize about the East, West, because it is a possibility actually to enlarge in the mind. Usually, of course, a lot of conference, it's all about details. It's about contemporary issues, and it gets very banal. It gets very ordinary, but it's also important. But I think it's important that we can also drift off, fantasize, because that might be the source of new inspiration. That might be the source to actually realize who we are and what actually derives our motives. So that's actually basically what I wanted to say. I was a bit too fast, I just remember. I still have 3 or 4 minutes. So, this is a key factors. This is the current situation we have to see. Eranos was actually started when there was a rise of fanatism ideologies, and there was the notion of timeless events. Issues which are timeless, which is also important. And of course, I think this is what Eranos also was, independent minds, because they weren't representatives, they didn't have any political task, goal, they just could meet and drink and go. And that, I think, was the great thing about Eranos. Encounter of ideas, celebration of seemingly irrelevant ideas. You know, so because many people would say, well, what we talk about is completely irrelevant. I mean, there are more important issues, and so. But that, I think, is so. It's an antidote, actually. It's something to modernity. And that way, it's very important to keep actually such vessels, and also that you're organizing something similar.
They didn't go as far as their neighbours on Monte Verita. I mean, they still were dressed and still
still
behaved
kept
in a
with
quite
civilized,
academic, orderly fashion.
Yeah. And they had the driver's license I assume they had the driver's license when they drew over Bogota.
Maybe, yes.
Maybe, well, it's not sure.
These are your key factors. I wrote down imagination.
Yeah.
And you mentioned passion.
Yeah.
And search for meaning.
Yeah.
Key factors.
Yes, it was a key factor. I mean, imagination, I think many people mentioned it already, so I didn't mention it again. I think imagination, that is actually a key factor, of course, of human beings, that we can imagine other scenes, that we can transport ourselves into sceneries which we've never experienced. And what is interesting about imagination from the psychological view, that it empowers us. This is something I experience when I work with juveniles, adolescent juveniles, which usually don't really want to meet a psychologist, and which are often very cynical. But as soon as I kind of can connect with their imaginations, then they usually change. Of course, their imaginations are usually not quite up to what one expects, but imagination has a tremendous power, and I think is one of the great sources and motives why we're doing things.
Do you, as a psychologist, see Eranos as a therapy after the 20s, when people were in need of sort of healing themselves, reconnecting to rationality and so on?
I don't think therapy. No, I don't think therapy, but I think it is as a search, a yearning for something else, a kind of a remedy in the sense way, in a remedy, to what was going on. People were searching for something else. They realized and the whole Ticino, the whole area had actually that quality.
Today, people go to rave parties.
Probably, yes.
I
don't know.
Or if you don't dance, you go to football matches.
Football matches can also
become
be
football hooligans. Or you go to a conference at Engelsberg where you get both of these good things.
Okay.
Thank you, Allan. Yes. Eduard, Iricinschi.
Thank you.
Eduard, on the Ascona Gnosis.
So, the summary. I will talk about two 20th century understandings of ancient Gnosis. I would call one experiential Gnosis and the other one visionary Gnosis. And then I will give some conclusions as what did they mean at Ascona and elsewhere. What did they mean when they talked about Gnosis? And I would offer that it's a cognitive cipher. So, first, what did they have in common before I delve into what is experiential Gnosis and what is visionary Gnosis? And I have to start by beginning. But there are not only two kinds of Gnosis, or there are not only two ways of understanding Gnosis in the 20th century. I can count 5, and I don't. When I teach this, I don't even teach the experiential Gnosis or the visionary Gnosis. This codified very strongly the understanding of ancient Gnosis at Eranos in the 1950s and 1960s. So they were local European and North American codified forms of understanding the past. So it's always. So what did they have in common? They both adopted phenomenological approaches, fusing either abstract assumptions or empirical observations with data collected from historical narratives, ethnographical accounts, religious literatures, and folklore. They reflected the study of religion in the first half of the 20th century. They are dated. We don't study religion as they used to do it back then. Within the academic discipline of history of religion, less so anthropology. They adopted a good degree of methodological generosity in comparing disjointed sets of cultural data. Let's call it methodological imagination. And finally, they relied on larger intellectual projects preoccupied with the status of the human mind and human relations after the Industrial Revolution, inquiring, so to speak, about new ways of coping with modernity. Yes. So that's to keep in mind how experiential Gnosis and visionary Gnosis are similar. The experiential understanding of Gnosis originated with Hans Jonas' 1934 first volume of Gnosis und spätantike Geist. The work came out of Jonas' 1928 dissertation, which he wrote under the academic supervision of Rudolf Bultmann, who had just become interested in Gnosticism and employed Mandean text to understand the Gospel of John, and philosophical influence of Martin Heidegger, who had published his opus Time and Being, Sein und Zeit, in 1927. The young Jonas defined the Greek concept of Gnosis as, and here I quote, a secret, revealed, and saving knowledge, not unlike the information communicated in ancient mystery religions about the creation of the superior worlds, its effects on the creation of this world, and implicitly on the human conditions. This was not a passive knowledge, however. Its divine economy presupposes a lapse of Gnosis outside its initial coordinates, a leak of information toward lower realms. It comes out. It's it's unmoored. The epistemic loss converts in Jonas' system into an ontological deficiency. This ontological fault translates for the ancient Gnostics in the creation of this world by an ignorant demiurge associated in some Gnostic text with the God of Genesis, the one we know from the Bible. Nothing ought to feel at home in this distorted creation. As a result, exile and a perpetual search for true knowledge best define human condition in the Gnostic late antique world. It is a beautiful myth. It's charming. It attracts us. It attracts the interest and the minds of ancient people and of modern scholars. For Jonas, ancient Gnosticism is reflected in the myth of alienation from and return to divinity. As scholars, we all have to keep in mind 1928, 1930s. So it's not only the alienation, it's something else, and we'll get to it. The alien life, described by Jonas as one of the great impressive word symbols which you encounter in Gnostic speech, forcefully conveys the condition of the soul cast away from transcendence and lost in this world as in a foreign country. With the concept of das Fremde, Jonas gives us an account of both the soul's transcendent origins and of her alienated condition as prisoner in the human body. To give a clear idea about the soul's circular trajectory from home to this world, her loss of compass in other worlds ruled by eons, and her final redemption and return back home, Jonas sketches a dualist topography of a topsy-turvy world where home is outside and where the soul engages in ambulatory expeditions from one dwelling to another, until the final stop where, here I quote Jonas, the otherworldly existence is also a dwelling, this time in the seats of light and life. Again, a beautiful myth, and for a long time this is what scholars understood to be Gnosis. In this malevolent landscape, the human soul wasted herself in vacuous details in the state of being thrown, a Heideggerian concept, becomes victim of a centrifugal dispersal and experiences classical depression symptoms: forlornness, dread, homesickness, and stupefaction, sleep, and drunkenness. Only a call from outside, brought by a savior figure in the form of a redemptive knowledge, could awaken the divine spark within the soul and offer her the necessary ritual instructions for the ascension back to the divine world. Jonas' understanding of Gnosticism as the cultural and religious reckoning with an existential malaise survived to this day. It was resurrected by Ugo Bianchi in the mid-1960s in a dualist key. It received structuralist, cognitive, and experientialist interpretations in Ioan Petru Culianu's work in 1980s. Oh, here. It received structuralist, cognitive, and experientialist interpretations in Ioan Petru Culianu's work in 1980s. Most recently, it witnessed an outburst of popularity after 2015 with April de Koninck's depiction of the ancient Gnostics as the members of an exceptionally brilliant countercultural movement seeking spiritual renovation and, I quote her, to reinvent religion so that it worked to heal humanity rather than charm the gods. With this ambitious line, I move to visionary Gnosis. It is precisely this emphasis on Gnosis as therapy that brings us to the second main understanding of Gnosis in the 20th century, that of visionary Gnosis, promoted by Carl Gustav Jung and explored at the Eranos meetings. Gnostic thinking, as it was presented in ancient Christian heresiological texts, took center stage in Carl Jung's self-exploration of what he later termed active imagination, a technique of control investigation of personal visualizations described at length in Jung's Black Books and in Liber Novus, the Red Books. It's a shortened version, both published over the last 2 decades. In the introduction to the English translations of the Red Book, Sonu Shamdasani described Carl Jung's 1916 Septem Sermones ad Mortus, privately published as the German translation of a spurious Greek text written by Basilides of Alexandria and part of the Black Books, as, and I quote Sonu Shamdasani, a psychological cosmology cast in the form of a Gnostic creation myth. Jung's analytical psychology shaped the study of Gnosis as an academic pursuit. Once the Nag Hammadi codices circulated out of Egypt, the one that is now labeled Nag Hammadi Codex I was purchased by the Jung Institute in Zurich and brought to Switzerland in 1952. For 2 decades afterwards, scholars refer to this 4th century artifact, the richest in Valentinian writings in the entire collection, as the Jung Codex. In the speech dedicated to the official receipt of this codex, delivered on November 15, 1953 in Zurich, Jung referred to one of its texts, the Gospel of Truth, to describe Gnosis as the, I quote him, phenomena of assimilation of the early Christian message within the pagan world. He compared Gnosis to the reaction of the psychic matrix, the unconscious, which becomes agitated and responds with archetypal images, thereby demonstrating to what degree the message has penetrated into the depths of the psyche and how the unconscious interprets the phenomena of Christ. So that's partly the answer whether about the Christian underlying of the Eranos meetings and of Jung's own conception about Gnosis. So images running amok, escaping the madhouse of the unconscious, and in bad need of therapeutical classification, reordering, and understanding, articulated the 20th century visionary Gnosis. Gilles Quispel, an eminent scholar of ancient Gnosis, announced the birth of the New World religion, Gnosticism, in his 1951 book, Gnosis als Weltreligion, published in Zurich. In the introduction of the book, Quispel expressed his gratitude to Jung for his constant interest in matters of Gnosis. And he says, "It is thanks to him," Quispel writes, "that the complex structure of Gnosis has become to a certain degree understandable to me." So Jung explained Gnosis to a scholar of Gnosticism. Finally, in a talk delivered at the 1968 Eranos meeting in Ascona, Gilles Quispel explicitly described Gnosis as a personalized, authentic myth, and as a result of a breakthrough of images. Nevertheless, Quispel says, Jung's experience is interesting for the student of Gnosticism as well, for it demonstrates that the Gnostic conceptions which are found in the sources are traceable to authentic experiences occurring even in our times. Gnosis is not an artificial myth or dressed-up philosophy bound to a particular period, but is rather, again I highlighted, authentic myth, imagistic thought, a breakthrough of images that is thus possible for every theistic religion and perhaps every person. If the experiences of the images did not take place, contemporary man would not be so gripped by and subjected to these ancient frightening myths. And he ends, Jung shows that even today there are experiences which lead man to make use of Gnostic symbols in order to make himself understood. That was 1968, 7 years after Jung's death. Finally, conclusions. Why is it important for us to unpack these two forms of translating ancient Gnosis to modernity? Fair warning, I can talk about at least another 3 modern translations of Gnosis in the modern world. These were very important at Eranos. One defined Eranos, the other one Eranos defined itself against. First, one was built from top to bottom by Jonas, adopting Heidegger's existentialist metaphysics. Second, the other one, Jung's, was built from bottom up, considering Jung's insistence about the empirical nature of his studies. Jung was adamant his research was always empirical. And finally, in both cases, thinking about ancient Gnosis became the cipher, the code, to articulate 2 different responses to cultural, personal, and moral dilemmas and incongruities of 2 world wars, of the rearrangement of world's political geography in the 20th century, what we now call, we the enlightened scholars call the post-colonial era, and the dramatic reorganization of human relations and understanding of the human mind in the late modernity. Thank you.